June 12th, 1944. Saint-Côme-du-Mont, Normandy. Hauptmann Werner Pluskat lowered his binoculars with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear but from disbelief. The American patrol moving through the hedgerow country below his observation post operated like nothing in German training manuals. No textbook formations, no parade ground discipline, just 5 soldiers moving with an aggressive confidence that seemed almost theatrical. What disturbed Pluskat most was their voices. Even at 200 meters, he could hear them actually arguing with each other during a combat patrol, their accents harsh and urban, nothing like the rural American speech his English instructors had taught him to expect. One soldier, a sergeant based on the stripes visible through the glass, was gesturing wildly with his hands while talking, completely abandoning his rifle's ready position. "They're not soldiers," Pluskat muttered to his radio operator. "They're gangsters in uniforms." Within 2 weeks, Pluskat would revise that assessment. These weren't gangsters. They were something the Wehrmacht had never encountered before, products of America's toughest urban environment, men who had survived Brooklyn and the Bronx and brought those survival skills to occupied France. They didn't fight by German rules because they'd never followed anyone's rules. They improvised, adapted, and overcame with a street-smart aggression that German doctrine had no answer for. The 29th Infantry Division that landed on Omaha Beach included disproportionate numbers of men from New York City, particularly Brooklyn. The 116th Infantry Regiment drew heavily from the mid-Atlantic states, while the 115th and 175th Infantry Regiments contained significant numbers of New Yorkers who had enlisted or been drafted from the 5 boroughs. These men brought something unexpected to the European battlefield, an urban mentality that had been forged in America's most competitive, aggressive, and diverse environment. German intelligence had studied American society extensively, but they'd focused on the wrong America. Their assessments emphasized rural farm boys, naive Midwesterners, soft suburbanites. The analysts in Berlin had created a profile of the American soldier based on Hollywood movies and tourist impressions. They'd never walked down Flatbush Avenue, never survived a Brooklyn winter, never learned that politeness in New York was optional, but toughness was mandatory. Sergeant Michael DeLuca from Bensonhurst epitomized what the Germans never expected. Before the war, he'd worked at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a job that required navigating Union politics, ethnic rivalries, and the casual violence of Depression-era New York. His squad included Corporal Anthony Marchetti from Red Hook, Private Joseph Goldstein from Brighton Beach, Private James O'Brien from Bay Ridge, and Private Robert Washington from Bedford-Stuyvesant. This wasn't a squad. It was a Brooklyn neighborhood dropped into Normandy. What made them different showed immediately in combat. During the brutal hedgerow fighting of June 1944, standard American tactics called for methodical advances, fire and maneuver by the book, careful coordination. The Brooklyn soldiers approached it differently. They treated each hedgerow like a Brooklyn street corner, their turf to take, their block to own. DeLuca's philosophy, shouted to his squad during a firefight on June 14th near Carentan, became legendary in the 29th Division. "Hey, these Krauts think they're tough. They never tried crossing Prospect Park at night. Let's show these punks what Brooklyn tough looks like." The German defenders, veterans from the Eastern Front who had faced fanatical Soviet attacks, found themselves psychologically unprepared for American soldiers who fought with personal insult and verbal aggression as tactics. During a 3-day battle for a fortified farmhouse near Isigny-sur-Mer, Corporal Marchetti spent hours shouting insults in Italian-accented English, then switching to actual Italian, then to fractured German he'd learned from his neighborhood's German immigrants. The psychological impact on German defenders was documented in captured unit diaries. Oberleutnant Hans Müller of the 352nd Infantry Division wrote on June 18th, "The Americans attack with bizarre aggression, shouting insults and challenges. They don't fear death, They seemed to welcome confrontation. This is not the soft American we were promised. What German observers couldn't understand was that Brooklyn had been these soldiers' first battlefield. Growing up in the Depression-era streets taught skills that translated directly to combat. Goldstein had survived anti-Semitic gangs in his neighborhood. Washington had navigated being black in a predominantly white borough. O'Brien had fought Irish gang wars in Bay Ridge. These weren't farm boys learning violence for the first time. These were urban survivors who'd been fighting their whole lives. The Germans had prepared for conventional American soldiers. They'd studied West Point tactics, analyzed regular army doctrine, and anticipated textbook warfare. The Brooklyn soldiers didn't fight from textbooks. They fought from experience, from street smarts, from an urban mentality that valued results over regulations. During the fighting around St. Lo in July 1944, standard procedure called for calling artillery support when encountering German strongpoints. That took time, required radio coordination, followed doctrine. Sergeant DeLuca's squad encountered a German machine gun nest on July 11th and solved it differently. While Wehrmacht defenders expected an American withdrawal to call for support, DeLuca sent Marchetti and O'Brien on an unauthorized flanking movement through a drainage ditch that maps showed as impassable. German defensive plans hadn't accounted for soldiers willing to crawl through sewage because they'd grown up near the Gowanus Canal. The two Brooklyn soldiers emerged behind the German position and convinced the defenders to surrender through what O'Brien later described as aggressive negotiating, using a combination of hand grenades, profanity, and the universal language of violence that transcended the German-English barrier. The incident violated multiple Army regulations about unauthorized tactical movements, but it succeeded. The 29th Division's after-action reports from June through August 1944 documented an unusual pattern. Units with high concentrations of urban soldiers, particularly from New York, showed disproportionate initiative in combat. They broke more rules, received more reprimands, and achieved more objectives. Their casualty rates were higher because they took more risks, but their success rates exceeded doctrinal predictions. The Brooklyn mentality manifested in unexpected ways. German soldiers surrendering to American forces expected formal military processing. When captured by Brooklyn soldiers, they got something different. Private Goldstein, processing prisoners on June 20th, treated it like a police lineup. "All right, yous guys," he announced to a group of terrified German teenagers. "Here's how this works. You behave, we treat you decent. You cause problems, we got problems. Capisce?" His casual mixing of English and Italian-American slang, delivered with Brooklyn-accented authority, created confusion and compliance. The German prisoners, expecting either brutal treatment or formal military courtesy, got neither. They got Brooklyn. The cultural shock worked in both directions. Wehrmacht soldiers who had fought across Europe encountering urban American aggression for the first time found their training inadequate. A captured German after-action report from the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, dated July 25th, described American troops from the 29th Division as fighting with unprecedented personal animosity, as if the war was a personal insult requiring violent response. The report noted that these Americans appeared to take offense at resistance itself, responding with what seemed like street gang mentality rather than military discipline. What the Germans identified as gang mentality was actually urban survival instinct. Brooklyn soldiers understood that in a street fight, hesitation meant defeat. In Normandy's hedgerows, that translated to immediate aggressive action. They didn't wait for orders when they saw opportunities. They didn't debate tactics when violence would solve problems. The New York attitude that said, "Never back down, never show weakness," translated directly to combat effectiveness. The ethnic diversity of Brooklyn units created another advantage Germans never anticipated. DeLuca's squad could communicate in Italian, Yiddish, Polish, Irish Gaelic, and street Spanish. In Normandy's multinational chaos, where French civilians, forced laborers from across Europe, and refugees filled the countryside, this linguistic flexibility provided intelligence advantages. Goldstein interrogated a Polish forced laborer in a mixture of Yiddish and Polish, learning German positions that aerial reconnaissance had missed. Marchetti convinced an Italian conscript soldier to reveal German defensive plans by speaking the dialect of Calabria he'd learned from his grandmother. The Germans had prepared for English-speaking Americans. They hadn't prepared for Americans who spoke everything. By August 1944, German intelligence reports specifically mentioned American units with urban soldiers as priority threats. A captured intelligence summary from the 7th Army Headquarters identified the 29th Infantry Division's Brooklyn Heavy Companies as demonstrating exceptional aggression and tactical flexibility that exceeded training-based predictions. The assessment concluded that American urban soldiers possessed psychological resilience that rural soldiers lacked, though German analysts couldn't explain why. The explanation was simple. Brooklyn was tougher than Normandy. De Luca explained it to a replacement soldier in late July. "Listen, kid, you survived Brownsville on a Saturday night. You can survive this. These Krauts are tough, sure, but they got nothing on the corner boys from Fulton Street. Just remember, you didn't come all the way to France to lose a fight." The Brooklyn attitude included something else Germans never anticipated: a complete lack of deference to authority that coexisted somehow with military effectiveness. Officers learned quickly that commanding Brooklyn soldiers required negotiation rather than orders. Lieutenant Richard Sullivan from Manhattan, commanding a platoon of predominantly Brooklyn enlisted men, described his leadership style as suggesting rather than commanding. "You didn't order Brooklyn soldiers, you convinced them." This democratic approach to military hierarchy shocked German prisoners who observed it. Wehrmacht discipline was absolute, hierarchical, unquestionable. They watched American sergeants argue with lieutenants, privates question captains, and somehow the entire system functioned. Unteroffizier Klaus Becker, captured in July, told interrogators that American discipline seemed non-existent. Yet American units achieved objectives German discipline couldn't match. He couldn't reconcile the contradiction. The post-war analysis revealed what German intelligence had missed. America's urban environment, particularly New York, had created a warrior culture disguised as civilian life. The same skills required to survive Brooklyn, situational awareness, aggressive posturing, quick decision-making, reading threats, calculated violence, were exactly the skills combat required. The Wehrmacht had trained soldiers for war. Brooklyn had raised soldiers for survival, and survival skills translated to combat more effectively than parade ground discipline. Sergeant De Luca survived the war with 2 Purple Hearts, a Bronze Star, and a reputation as one of the 29th Division's most effective squad leaders. In a 1988 interview, he summarized the Brooklyn advantage. "The Germans were good soldiers, real professional, but they never understood that we weren't fighting for democracy or freedom or any of that big picture stuff. We were fighting because losing wasn't an option. In Brooklyn, you don't lose. You don't back down. You don't quit. We brought that to France, and the Germans never figured out how to fight that attitude." The story of Brooklyn soldiers in Normandy reveals a truth about American military power that German planners never grasped. America's strength wasn't just industrial capacity or technological advantage. It was cultural diversity that created soldiers from every background, every ethnicity, every environment. The Brooklyn soldiers, who brought New York attitude to Normandy, were products of America's toughest urban crucible. The Germans had prepared for American soldiers. They never prepared for Brooklyn. In the hedgerows of Normandy, street smarts beat military science. Urban aggression overwhelmed trained discipline, and Wehrmacht veterans who had conquered Europe learned that Brooklyn was tougher than anything they'd faced before.